Hi, everybody. So I'm Joachim, I'm your producer of today, and I'm one of the iPride site leads in Dublin. And Dublin is also the office where I have been for almost 6 years now with Indeed. And I was here when Indeed participated for the first time in Dublin Pride. And I have been involved with iPride when it was still called Outdeed, actually, ever since. So June is the Pride month across the globe. So various events are held during this special month as a way of recognizing the influence of LGBTQI plus people, so the influence that they have had, and to celebrate diversity, inclusion, and belonging. At Indeed, we're no different, and we bring Pride to the office, while under these circumstances, actually to your home. June was chosen as Pride Month because it commemorates the Stonewall riots that occurred way back in 1969 in New York. I'm joined today by Olivia.
Hey everyone, I'm Olivia. Happy Pride. I'm one of the co-chairs here for iPride EMEA with my amazing counterpart, David. I'm located in London and was the founding team for the Scottsdale iPride and also the London iPride. So what is iPride? iPride is here to help LGBTQ employees be themselves and educate the business to embrace inclusion, as well as making changes to products to be more inclusive. Our goal here today is to give some education and awareness of some of our intersectionality in the LGBT community. This is also something we hope to continue to highlight in iPride and definitely bring a bigger understanding of LGBT inclusion in sports and how we can develop partnerships with those in that area.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. For today, our Fireside Chat with Amazin LeThi is part of a broad offering of events globally at Indeed for Pride Month. Amazin will share her personal journey going from homelessness to becoming one of the most visible and influential LGBTI plus activists in the world currently. Her story as an author, as an athlete, advocate, storyteller, and openly out Asian woman inspires people, and it helps them achieve their full potential in life and live more authentically. So we'll have a chat with her, and there'll be some time for Q&A towards the end of, or the second part of the session. I'm honored now to give the floor to our VP of Sales and CS, Derek Divney, who will lead this Fireside Chat and guide you on this wonderful journey of Amazin LeThi. Enjoy this inspiring chat and happy Pride.
Thanks to you, Joachim. Happy Pride, everyone. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Derek, VP of Client Success and Sales in EMEA, and I'm delighted to have you all here today for what should be an enthralling Fireside Chat. Now, the discussion today will contain reference to bullying and racism and could be triggering for many of us. So you may have noticed in a lot of our communications recently from Chris, Dave, and others that we think it's important to share this content warning and to recognize the importance of mental and emotional well-being of all employees, to allow employees the opportunity to opt out of listening to triggering around some of this sensitive information. Also, please know that this webinar is being recorded. So before I get into the Fireside Chat, I also wanted to share details of what Indeed has been doing to support the LGBTQ plus community recently. So last year, Indeed developed the Gender, Identity and Transition Guidelines. They were created by our very own Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging team in partnership with HR and our iPride chapters. And they speak to ways in which Indeed supports Indeedians who are transitioning in the workplace. Also in the past years, Indeed has sponsored the Dublin Pride Festival, and you saw many of those photos just at the start of the event today. And this year, we're delighted to be a silver sponsor for the virtual Dublin Pride Festival, which is now on and runs to the 28th of June. And then just last week, iPride and DIMB hosted a fantastic webinar with the Gender Cool Champions, who are a youth-led movement replacing misinformed opinions with positive, powerful experiences, meeting remarkable kids who identify as transgender and non-binary. So please watch the recording on Igloo if you haven't seen it already. And finally, a reminder that iPride Inclusion Group have chapters in both London and Dublin in case you want to join or be involved or become an ally. And we'll definitely talk about allyship in our Fireside Chat today. So now let's get ready to move to the main attraction. So I want to warmly welcome Amazin. I think Joachim did a pretty good job of giving an overview, but Amazin's rich and colorful background cannot be summarized in just a few snippets. She has a phenomenal experience, and I'm so excited that she will share it today. So I'm going to start straight away with getting into the questions. So Amazin, can you tell us a bit about yourself? And I'd love you to touch some of the big points in your personal journey, some homelessness, mental health, bullying, discrimination. But yeah, if you could just give us an overview and tell us more about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Firstly, my pronouns are she and her. I mean, really, I wouldn't be the person that I am today if it wasn't for my journey. And I think, you know, when you think of so many advocates in the community, it's because of the journey that they had. So I was from an orphanage in the Vietnam War, and I was adopted by a couple at the time living in Australia. So I grew up at a time in Australia where there was a terrible amount of racism in the community. So I understand in terms of going through this kind of Trump administration, you know, I went through that when the government publicly came out and said that, you know, we don't want to be Asianized and we're being invaded by the Asian community. I suffered a terrible amount of bullying and discrimination as a child because I grew up in an all-white background, but I looked visibly different. I mean, I can't switch and switch off being Asian. And also inside, I really struggled with my sexuality inside as well. You know, there were no Asian people on TV. I had no points of reference. I never saw an LGBTQ person. So I felt very alone and very isolated in my feelings. And I literally felt like I thought I was the only Asian LGBTQ person in the world and the only LGBTQ person. I think many LGBTQ people go through those experiences, particularly if you don't see a mirror image of yourself. I suffered a terrible amount of bullying from society, from my school kids, from teachers, Asian slurs. You know, the kids knew I was different, but they couldn't pinpoint on what that difference was. So I then started to get the gay slurs as well. And that's obviously very hurtful for an LGBTQ child because it pinpoints who you are, but also there's that confusion as to why they're turning something that should be celebrated into something very derogatory. I was teased by my teachers, and I think, you know, that's unfortunately very common for LGBTQ kids. I remember once as a child that my teacher made me stand up in front of all the kids. I must have been like 7 or 8, and there were about 30 kids. And the teacher said to everyone, this is an example of what failure looks like. And at most in life, this is the person that will fail. And if anything, they will become a potato peeler, if that's. And I just felt so humiliated. And I just remember standing there as a kid thinking, I will never feel this humiliated again, or anyone else feel like that. And then all the kids laughed at me. And then I sat down and I just kind of thought, I can't cry because everyone's staring at me. And then she threw the blackboard eraser. And I just remember it hitting me just there on their heads. You know, and I didn't have many friends as a kid. So, you know, I went into sports at a very young age. And I think because you're, you know, as a child, you're always trying to find a sense of community and belonging. And I felt that sports would do that for me. And I was very good at sports, but being someone from a minority background, I saw that there were no Asian kids in sports. So that was very difficult. So the bullying kind of followed me into sports, and I was bullied by my classmates, my other team members, and I was bullied by the coach, and I was bullied by the other teams. and so I felt it wasn't conducive as an environment. So there I fell into bodybuilding at such a young age. You know, I actually started weight training at 6, which was obviously very unusual for an Asian kid and a girl. But I loved the sport because I think physically it started to change me, and it gave me that sense of self-worth and belonging that I needed to make myself feel good about myself. But I realized very quickly that, one, it was a very male-dominated sport, and it was very misogynistic, very kind of locker room talk, and very kind of heteronormative. So I then I went from kind of racism and bullying to misogyny and sexism, you know, to my face and behind my back. But as a kid, obviously you don't know what to say to that. So that kind of really shaped me in terms of my equality work that I do today, because I just kind of remember how I felt as a very marginalized kid there. And then in my late teens, I started to compete competitively as a natural bodybuilder. I qualified as a personal trainer, but I had still a lot of struggles within me because of the amount of trauma that I had suffered over the years, with the amount of bullying, the racism, struggles with my sexuality, still not seeing an LGBTQ person and not being able to really pinpoint how I felt inside, but knowing that I felt very different. I left Australia at kind of as a late teen, young adult. I pretty much spent my whole life working to move out of a country that felt like it hated me so much because of the racism that I experienced there. And because I held a lot of trauma in when I started to travel through Europe and through the US, you know, I think like many of us, you know, we're one paycheck away from poverty. And, you know, it's so easy to fall into the bad crowd. And I ended up in the bad crowd. I think I just kind of literally exploded because I held so much trauma in, you know, the bad crowd that was partying all night, doing drugs, you know, alcohol, smoking, everything. And I just spiraled out of control. And one thing led to another. And I ended up homeless. And I think it would have had to be my darkest years being homeless and living in and out of shelters. And the way society treats you when you're living on the absolute margin of society, and knowing that constantly you're made to feel like nothing. You know, I remember begging one day because I just didn't have any money, and just kind of feeling less than the dirt that people walked on, and just the glances that people give you that, oh, that person just can't help themselves, why are they begging? But they just don't understand your situation. And it was really, really tough for me. I had suffered from severe depression. My mental health was up and down all the time. I was very suicidal. And I just kind of have, you know, 2 very strong points of reference where I cried. I slept for 2 days straight. I woke up on the 3rd day crying for 24 hours. And I just remember sitting in the shelter in like a fetal position, thinking, what has come of my life? I have sunk to the absolute bottom. And if I go any further, I just remembered that moment when my teacher made me stand up as a kid and said that's what failure looked like. And I'm thinking that would be my greatest failure if I committed suicide, because that's what failure looked like. And that I have so much more to give. I don't know what it is, but I have so much more to give. And for some people that might seem really strange when you absolutely have nothing, but you're thinking in your heads, I have so much more to give. Like, this is not my moment. And I think that why and my years of being an athlete helped me survive my darkest hours, because I learned how to push past the pain barrier. And it was the hardest thing that I have ever done, pulling myself out of homeless. It took me years. I had a mental breakdown while doing it. Then since that mental breakdown, that took me years. And, you know, I think from there, that's, you know, definitely molded me into the person that I am today, in terms of how passionate that I am to support marginalized communities, the understanding that I have around LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness, and the reasons why I champion sports so strongly in terms of, you know, particularly LGBTQ people, that everyone has to have this opportunity to sport because of the unique skill sets that you can bring to your life through sports. And I know if it weren't for sports, I wouldn't be sitting here today.
So yeah, thank you, Amazin. I mean, I figured your opening introduction was just going to be so powerful, but also the trauma and just the challenges you went through earlier in your life, but which have obviously molded you as a person and given you the strength to do what you're doing now. But yeah, just thank you for sharing that. You know, the one thing I noticed is, and we started, as we were educating ourselves here, and indeed we talk about intersectionality, the fact that there isn't just one group or one marginalized group. And you seem to be, you know, lots of different marginalized, you know, racist, LGBTQ, Asian. Can you kind of help us understand what you went through, so we can also understand and sympathize, empathize, and maybe support, you know, groups who have multiple layers of being marginalized. So, you know, where they just have these extra barriers to be successful in life, or just to get on and survive in life.
Sure. I mean, obviously I can speak to particular experience of what it is to be Asian and what it is to be Asian and LGBTQ, because we do face very specific challenges and barriers in terms of, you know, one, when you think of your company, of why you don't see that many Asian LGBTQ people that are openly out, and the reasons why we struggle so deeply in terms of sharing our story and in terms of talking about social issues. And that also comes down to a cultural reason as well. I mean, when I think about this whole experience of coming out, in the Asian community, it's very much seen as a Western ideology of coming out, because for us, it's all about coming home. As soon as we're born, it's what are you going to do for the family? What job are you going to get? What university you're going to get? How much money you're going to earn? Because at some point you will have to look after the entire family. And even if you're living in the West, you know, many Asian people living in the West, if they're not in the UK or the US or in Australia, they're still giving a percentage of their salary and sending it back home to their family back in
coming
Asia.
is even more challenging, even more traumatic, and it's more loaded, I suppose, maybe from an Asian background than
it is. And also intertwined is that is the shame and failure associated with being anything other than what your parents have envisioned you. Because for the most part, you know, Asian people were all immigrants. Our parents worked so hard to come to the West, and they have this idea in their head that, you know, we're going to work in the city because that will give us a good job. Then we'll earn enough money to help pay the bills. We will get married. They will have grandchildren. And at the end of the day, we're looking after our grandparents.
Predestined path that you're supposed
it is an absolutely predestined path. And heaven forbid if you're anything else but straight, because that would be the ultimate shame and failure. And then what can I say to my community and relatives? I can't then talk about how fantastic you are. And it's also very difficult for us to talk about these social issues as well. So, you know, that becomes very challenging. And also within the Asian unit, I mean, that, and particularly in Asia and even in the West, families live on top of each other. So you have multiple generations living with each other who know your business. So then it makes very hard to separate your kind of work and personal life.
The privacy boundaries are pretty thin.
Yes, and it's also the, we also have to look to the media in terms of how the media portrays ethnic community groups. You know, the Asian community, we're seen as this invisible model minority race where nothing happens to us. If you ever look at a commercial where you see a doctor or some kind of safe role, it's always an Asian person. So it's always perpetrated that nothing happens to us. But Asian youth are bullied the most out of all ethnic groups. Asian college students contemplate suicide more than any ethnic group or more than any white student. Asian LGBTQ people are bullied the most as well. In sports, we're bullied the most. We have the lowest participant rate, but the highest dropout rate. So we have all these alarming factors, but it's just not shown.
So with that context, how did you prepare yourself, or how did you message your coming out story? Like, how did that happen for you?
Sure. I mean, I always feel a bit difficult around the whole coming out story, because I have always seen, and I think, you know, we need to rephrase it of, when did you invite people into your story? Because coming out places pressure on an LGBTQ person. At some point, they have to share their story with the world, and not always we do. It's for the most part, it's more about us feeling very comfortable with who we are inside, to a point that I feel the environment that's created around me has become safe, that at some point I might invite you in to my story. And for me, it was a process over many years. And, you know, I actually, in my private life, I actually hate talking about myself. It was very difficult for me to publicly, you know, think of sitting here today and speak to over 300 people and share my story. And, you know, it's actually only when I started my charity work that I really started to invite people in and share my story. And, you know, thinking of myself and so many LGBTQ people, because throughout our entire lives, we're always made to feel that we're not worthy of who we are, and that we're not enough, and that we're not worthy of the love for ourselves and not worthy of the love from others, which does not make then a very conducive and supporting environment for us then to feel comfortable in terms of inviting people in to share our story. And I was always bullied every time I stood up and said anything. I was always bullied and ridiculed. So I never felt comfortable in doing that. But I realized that as my journey continued as this kind of global LGBTQ advocate, I had to be brave and be vulnerable and share my story as, obviously, as a role model and as a storyteller within the community of, you know, what is possible, because I can't expect other people to invite me into their space and share their story if I couldn't do it myself.
Well, you know, thank you so much for being brave, being vulnerable, and sharing it with us today. One thing I wanted to go right at the start, you mentioned your preferred pronouns. So can you tell us a bit about what pronouns mean to you and the importance of pronouns?
Sure. So my pronouns are she and her, and I identify as a cisgender woman. Pronouns are so important in the LGBTQ community because it's so tied to our identity. And that, you know, and for many of us, you know, if you say the incorrect pronoun, you're somehow erasing part of who I am and my identity, and are not acknowledging the space that I hold at that time with you. And I know a lot of people, particularly allies, have, and even myself in the LGBTQ community, because our pronouns now have, the spectrum of the LGBT community is so vast now. You know, I didn't even know that non-binary existed as a child. And I didn't know that there were pronouns of, you know, they, them, and Z. And I think that if you don't know, it's okay to ask. And I think if you feel uncomfortable in asking, then you can be the first person when you meet someone and say, hi, my name is Amazin and my pronouns are she and her. Because then that means that other person will probably instigate by saying my pronouns are such and such. I think, you know, language is so important.
So important, and I think that's so important for allies as well to go on that educational journey and realize they'll make a few missteps, and maybe we'll get onto allyship later. I just wanted to talk to you a bit more about the sporting side of things as well. So could you talk to me a bit more about your role in driving LGBTQ inclusion in sports? And obviously you had some kind of really tough experiences early on, but how have you been able to drive that inclusion in sports?
Sure. So I was the first Asian athlete ally ambassador in 2014. So they're a New York-based organization that challenges homophobia and transphobia in sports. And then at the end of 2019, I became the first Asian Stonewall UK sports champion ambassador. I mean, sports has been so much of my life. It's like brushing my teeth. I've never known a life without sports. So the shutdown has been really hard for me. I've had to kind of pivot with the type of sports that I do. Sport is a language that everyone understands. It unifies us in a way that, we can't comprehend. So it becomes the perfect platform to champion social injustice, racial inequality, and LGBTQ rights, because every country participates in sports. And so when I'm having conversations, I always speak through the lens of sports, because we must remember the LGBTQ narrative is not everyone's story, but sports, for the most part, is the story of many people. And even if they aren't interested in sports, in some sector, they're doing some kind of leisure sports so they can understand, how powerful that platform is.
You talked, particularly, I suppose, the challenges of maybe being a competitive bodybuilder, and it's very male, testosterone driven. So there's still a lot of inequality in sport. What do you think we need to do to drive that equality throughout sports and different sports?
Sure. I mean, when it comes to the inequality in sports, particularly around just not seeing any ethnic groups in the way that we should. I mean, a year ago when they were talking, the last Olympics, they say, we've never had so many LGBTQ athletes at the Olympics. What they should have said is that we've never had so many white LGBTQ athletes at the Olympics, because there wasn't an Asian LGBTQ athlete. I think there might have been like one Black athlete, but that's still not enough. And in terms of how we drive more D&I in sports, we have to go down to the grassroots level and check on our unconscious bias. We have to have training around D&I and unconscious bias training. We have to, talk within the different communities, because I think particularly within the Asian community, because our parents are immigrants and they're thinking, you have to have that good city job. They're not thinking you have to have that fantastic football job like David Beckham. So there's, education around, you can have a, sports as a career. And I think, companies, they have a responsibility within sports, because you drive sponsorship. We can't have major sports events without sponsorship. So companies have to, step up and have those conversations around D&I, pushing the needle in terms of pushing sports organizations to do better. When a lot of major sports events are in countries with anti-LGBTQ laws, companies have a responsibility then to raise the bar in terms of saying, maybe we shouldn't have that sports event there because we can't protect the safety of the LGBTQ community. And if we do have to have it there, these are the things that have to be done to make sure there's protection, but also after the sports event is over.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You're starting to touch on, these big multi-country corporations, people with power, key decision makers, the role they play. I think that brings us nicely onto allyship and the importance of allies. My own experiences, I worked with Microsoft and Google before I joined Indeed. And for me, it was a real journey. I started to understand my own privilege, white, straight, male, Anglo-Saxon background. And my career progression was very strong. And I realized I had to help and open doors for people from more marginalized background. And part of it was just the education I'd got earlier in my life. I was able to empower and help other groups. And then I went on to sponsoring diversity and inclusion groups within those organizations. But I'd love to hear from you. What is your aspiration for, what does it mean to you to be an ally, both in the personal role that you're doing so effectively, and maybe your advice to employees working in Indeed and the role we could have, because potentially we're influencing thousands of employers that employ hundreds of thousands of people. So the influence we have and the fairness we can bring to employment and helping people get equal opportunity is amazing if we can unlock and educate ourselves and how to be amazing allies.
Sure. So I want to touch on allyship on different points. Obviously, I want to speak about the current situation around the transgender movement and Black Lives Matter. But first, I want to chat about, what it is to be an ally to, say, an Asian LGBTQ person and an LGBTQ person. I think it's just the little things that allies can do. And when I think of allies, I think there are two levels. There's an ally that a person says, yes, I support LGBTQ rights, but then really you need to step up and be an advocate, because it's what's said in the tea room. It's what's said with other colleagues when I'm not there, when you call out homophobia, when you call out biphobia, when you call out transphobia, when you call out racism and sexism and all the isms. It's, and it's also about, how do we create safe and nurturing environments in the workplace so LGBTQ people feel like they can invite you into their story. And that comes back down to one, language, because there's an awkwardness when we use very gender conforming language, such as, what did you do on the weekend with my boyfriend or with my girlfriend? But some people don't refer as boyfriend and girlfriend. They could be non-binary, or they could say partner. So you might want to use neutral terms like partner, because that then makes that other person feel comfortable. Small things in, wearing the rainbow pin, showing that you're wearing, a badge with your pronouns, and understanding what it is to be LGBTQ in the community. And I think, obviously, how do we create environments for Asian LGBTQ people to feel more comfortable is creating, in Asia, pride networks sometimes don't work so well because people are so afraid to come out, even into a pride network. You have to have like a pride and ally network. And I always think, how do you encourage these safe and nurturing environments? One of ways through sports. So Indeed, as a company, could partner with other companies with sports, with their LGBTQ networks, but also invite everyone into that. So that creates a safe, nurturing environment indirectly, but also people don't feel like they're having to kind of come out, so to speak, when they're playing. And also, storytelling. I think storytelling is so important because sometimes within the workplace, we don't know who our executive sponsor could be. We don't know who is going to support us. But if we're having internal events and we're showing, it has to be from the top down, top leadership supporting the LGBTQ community, then I know instantly, then I might be able to go to that person and have a confidential conversation. But also I know this is a safe and nurturing environment because top management is supporting who I am in the workplace. When I think of allyship and being an advocate for the transgender community, I think, education is so important. We have to go back into history and know if it weren't for the transgender community throwing the first brick at the Stonewall riots, we wouldn't have the LGBTQ movement we have today. We owe everything to the transgender community. And I think, in terms of what's happening around all these anti-trans bills, around the bathroom bill, around unfortunately, places like Idaho, I think Idaho, Connecticut, Tennessee, many cities in the US, obviously the UK and Hungary, many places around the world have, very anti-trans bills or laws or thinking of implementing them. So it's like, you know, how in the workplace then can you be an ally and an advocate? You know, making sure that your workplace is trans inclusive, that you have trans policies, those who want to transition through work, that you have that, you know, within your healthcare policy, that you support the trans community, that you have gender neutral toilets, that you celebrate, you know, trans days, trans remembrance days, and that you have storytelling, and that you also look at special programming to lift transgender people up within the workforce. I mean, I was one of the first to give out, I was the first in Vietnam to give out educational scholarships to transgender youth that were experiencing homelessness. And it was $1,000 that I gave out to each youth. And to them, it was life-changing. It was like giving someone $100,000. And I thought, how that was such a simple, it's not brain science, it was such a simple act, because of that money, they were able to go to college, they could lift themselves out of poverty, out of sex work, out of everything that they were doing, and back into the workforce as leaders with a job and with a future. And I think when we're looking at I think companies now coming out of the shutdown need to look at CSR programming and internship programming very differently, because the LGBTQ community is our most marginalized community. And it's like, you know, how do we lift that sector? And, you know, what does that mean being an advocate? It just doesn't mean, you know, raising the rainbow flag in June and having a few Pride events. It's like 365 days a year. And then currently, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, in terms of my work as an advocate in the work that I do around social and racial inequality, I owe everything to the Black community. You know, we actually owe everything to the Black community, because in terms of the civil rights movement, you know, if it weren't for Martin Luther King, if it weren't for Malcolm X, we wouldn't have the movement that we have now. And in terms of, you know, using sports as a platform for equality, we need to go back to 1968, when 2 African-American men raised their fists in the air against human rights. And then when Colin Kaepernick knelt. And I think, you know, I wouldn't be doing the athlete activism that I'm doing today if it weren't for Black athletes that I could see within that movement. You know, and when I think of being Asian and LGBTQ and the human rights that I do now, and, you know, what's my place within the Black Lives Matter movement as an advocate, you know, I have to remember that Asian liberation is intertwined with Black liberation, and that my identity as an Asian person, I have to give thanks to the Black civil rights movement. Because if you look back in history, you know, the Black community were always there for my community. They were the first to stand up in terms of refugees. They marched against the Vietnam War, stating it wasn't the Vietnamese, it was racist white America. So it's like we have all these different points of reference. And the Asian community was there for the Black community. You know, one of the first members of the Black Panther Party was a Japanese American man. In the 1960s, there were many Asian women who were leading the Black empowerment movement. So, you know, when we think of allyship and advocacy and being an advocate, we have to remember our history, who was there before our time, who have always been there for us, and the reasons why we need to step up now. And, you know, with our conversations center around the Black Lives Matter and Black trans lives and the, you know, the transgender community. And, you know, what are we doing as a company to support those conversations?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. All these movements are very complementary and actually help and support each other. And so, I mean, thank you again. The power of storytelling is so important. And you know, I think you'll help to educate us and think about how we can create that psychological safety and increase the bar for LGBTQ. So I'm just very conscious. I want to make sure I leave some time for our audience members to get in and ask some questions. So maybe I'll hand over to Olivia, who can start taking us through some of the audience questions.
Hey guys, thank you so much, Amazin, so far. So I do have a few questions for you from our audience. One is from our Asian Network group. And the first question would be, how do you think you can get more Asian people into sport in the UK across all ages?
Sure. I mean, this is something that I'm working towards at the moment because, you know, when I look at professional sports, we just have so few Asians at the top. And then if you want an Asian LGBTQ person that's out, well, you have to have more Asians in sport. It's making sports more accessible to everyone. I mean, I think, you know, it's like, what can Indeed do right now in terms of making sports more accessible to everyone? It's making sure that you do have sports as part of your work environments and encourage people, but also going to the Asian networks and asking, you know, what kind of sports would you like to play? And, you know, how can we as a company support that? In terms of society, I mean, this is what I'm working on now. With the UK government, I'm leading on, you know, Tokyo 2021, Beijing 2022. You know, it's in a very interesting time around, you know, sport and being Asian, because over the next few years, all the major sports events happen to be in Asia. But that's kind of checking right down to the school level, making sure that sports is accessible to everyone, you know, having these programs around unconscious bias, companies like yourself sponsoring the community projects that are around sports and encouraging, you know, different communities around sports.
No, that makes sense. We're actually talking to Stonewall Football Club, which is part of Stonewall, the team Pride. And we're really excited to continue working with them, especially here in London, and do more games, like friendly games with them to get more inclusive, especially with the LGBT sports and that area of things. So my next question would be, during the horrible bullying you suffered as a child, did anyone support, protect you? And what would you say to them today?
No. You know, I had no leaders and mentors or no support network when I was a child. So it was really just me alone, you know, and it was very difficult because I had no points of reference in terms of, you know, who I could become or anyone that had kind of gone through what I had gone through. You know, what I did do, because I didn't really have that many friends, I went to the library and read a lot about people who went through great hardship, but overcame that through, I mean, I think two of my favorite topic people were, you know, Walt Disney, someone who had this amazing dream, obviously wasn't really bullied, but had gone through something really difficult, but came out on the end. But, you know, I think what really helped me was sport, because it gave me a purpose and a sense of focus. And it gave me the confidence to know that I could push past through different points in my life that were very difficult. And that's why I share my story now, because I realized how difficult it was for me then, because there was no one like me sharing their story.
No, and from what I've heard from other people, like that is definitely a struggle with the Asian community coming out, is there is that sometimes a lack of support and maybe misunderstanding. So it's really exciting to have you here and kind of breaking those barriers down for us. So our next question is actually from Chandra. She says, happy Pride Amazin. Thank you for sharing your story. It's so powerful. I know the work you do often involves travel and being in the room with people. What tips do you have for us? How can we support a time where we can't get together in the office?
Sure. I mean, this is a very challenging time for everyone. I mean, even myself, and it's, you know, it's hard to get used to kind of just sitting in front of a computer all day and speaking to people and not being able to touch them. You know, I really think it's important as a company with your staff, when everyone is isolated in different sectors of the world, to have really fun social events. So with one company in New York, actually, I helped them create a social calendar for them that included drag bingo, that included movie nights, that included fireside chats. So I think that's important as well. And also to reach out to your staff and think, you know, in this time, what is it that you need from us to better support you being at home. So, you know, you can, I mean, I know it's kind of difficult to have like, you know, a cocktail happy hour over Zoom, but you can still do it though, you know, just to feel connected with everyone else who is meant to be in the room, but not.
It's definitely a struggle here because we are all over. But that online, those drag bingo and things along those lines, those are things we're trying to promote, at least here in London and in Dublin. So it's also nice to hear you're doing the same things. So we have another question. How would you suggest starting the conversation around LGBT rights with people that have strong negative biases due to their cultural upbringing?
Yeah, I mean, that is really difficult. And I have those difficult conversations all the time, particularly across the US and particularly when I go into Asia. And I don't start with the LGBTQ narrative because it's not their story and it's not their narrative, and instantly the walls come up. So I usually start to get to know that person of, you know, what got them to their position. So when I pilot, and I think this is a good example. So when I piloted the first leadership, sports, business and education program that I'm planning to launch in the West next year in Vietnam, I had very difficult conversations with executives that would sit in front of me as like, we don't support the LGBTQ community, LGBTQ people don't exist, you know, not, you know, and I realized that I couldn't go in with that narrative. So I went in terms of just finding out about their story, like how did they get to that position? And for many of them, it was poverty that led them to education. And so from there, I was able to kind of come in the back door through being LGBTQ. But then if you're then speaking to someone who is, you know, yes, has very negative views, is very religious, has a very conservative background, it is really challenging, and you have to take baby steps, because if you're going right in with the LGBTQ story, you know, you will get backed up against the wall. And I just tend to come in, I mean, this has obviously just been a very individual thing for me, and I think it really depends on who you're speaking to, but I always try and find a point of reference with that person. It could be that they have an interest in sports. It could be that they had hardship in their life and someone helped them out, or, you know, they were living in poverty and through education, they became the executive that they are today. So I tend to use that point of reference to help them chat about their story. And then I start speaking about my story through storytelling and let them know, you know, the hardships that, without telling them that I'm from the LGBTQ community, and telling them about the hardship that I went through and who the person that I am today and the work that I do, and then my point of reference that I'm LGBTQ. And not always you can win that person over. Sometimes you have to have numerous conversations. And I know in Vietnam with my program, I had to have many conversations with people who weren't LGBTQ friendly, but through storytelling, we were able to get to that point where we connected, because through storytelling, they realized that we may be different, but we're the same, and that we have very similar experiences. The only difference is part of your identity is LGBTQ, and that's obviously not my identity, but you have to give it time. You know, you may need to just have many conversations with that person. There has to be some kind of patience as well, because it can take that other person time to get to that point.
So I think I've got one shout out from you, from Caleb, not a question, but as someone who's experienced homelessness, listening to your story was truly inspiring and healing in a way. Thank you, Amazin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So our last question is, as you are someone who is very intersectional, how do we support our friends or family who have intersectional backgrounds, especially when most of us live with privilege?
Sure. You know, I always think we have to start through storytelling, of sharing our stories. I mean, I obviously now I share my story a lot, and through my storytelling, people can understand that, yes, I'm a whole person, but there are different sections of my identity that make me whole. And I think, you know, it's understanding that that we're not just kind of, you know, one dimensional and that's all who we are, but it's being conscious about, you know, intersectionality. And, you know, I always kind of think, you know, the question that you need to ask is everyone in the room when you're having conversations, because, you know, if you're trying to do something about Black Lives Matter and they're all white people in the room, that's not being intersectional, and we're not having the rights conversation. And it's about being, you know, having these courageous, brave conversations and making sure that, you know, everyone's in the room and that we can see someone of everyone. I hope that kind of answers the question. But I think a lot of, for me, a lot of it's done through storytelling, because we don't fully know of someone's intersectional identity until they share through their storytelling.
I mean, I know personally, I go by fluid, I'm female, I'm culturally Jewish, and people don't necessarily see me as that. So that is always a battle that I have to face, especially when I may necessarily pass, because I do identify as a female. So intersectionality is something that is a big part of my identity, because there are things that you may not see but are also very important to me, like internally. So lastly, if you want to know more about Amazin and her incredible work, we're going to go and put something in our chat, so you'll be able to reach out and see her website. I'm going to go pass off here to David, who's going to close this off for us today.
Hi everyone, I'm David, the co-chair of iPride for EMEA. So what can you do next? So firstly, education. There are lots of great TED Talks, books, podcasts about being an ally. DI&B are also currently piloting an ally skills building workshop. More information will be coming on that soon. You can use Crescendo. Crescendo is a micro-learning app that's integrated into Slack to provide educational articles and videos for a wide range of topics. You can find more information about that on Igloo. Next, you can join iPride. So we've lots of different ways for you to join. We have Slack channels that you can join. For EMEA, they're iPride Dublin and iPride London, and we have a global iPride channel as well. Links for those are in your calendar invite. You can also start a chapter in your office if you already don't have one. You can reach out to Olivia or myself, and we're more than happy to meet with you and talk about that. Share your experiences and key takeaways from today with your colleagues, friends, and family. You can also share them internally on Slack, so we can keep the conversation going, or externally using the Inside Indeed hashtag as well, externally. Also, we will have a short survey that's going to be linked in the chat as well, so we can gather some insights for our next events coming up. So I would like to firstly thank Amazin for her time today and giving us so much to think about. I'd like to thank Derek for moderating the event and Tracy for helping with scheduling. I'd like to thank AV, employee communications and employee experience teams for their support and help. I'd like to thank Jill from DI&B for her help with coordinating this event and our ongoing support for iPride and IRGs. I'd like to thank Olivia and the Dublin iPride team, Joachim, Lou, and Jamie for bringing this event to life. Finally, I would like to thank everyone who has joined this event and wish you all a happy Pride.